everyone, welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your host, Arif, and as always, I'm joined by my friend and colleague.
Myself, TK. I'm a person that still is thinking who to vote for.
Well, timely comment there, TK, because, for many of our listeners here in the UK anyway, we're all, I'm sure by now, fully aware that we are in election campaign mode because the UK is gearing up for elections in July, 4th of July to be precise.
Most certainly hard not to be aware, yes.
Exactly. And if you're from other parts of the world, maybe news has reached you as well.
Or you'll have your election soon.
Oh, you have your own elections, exactly. But yeah, so here in the UK, as we move closer to that election date, the two main parties are, of course, battling out for votes. The Tories, led by Prime Minister Sunak, have decided, as part of their policy announcements, to hark back to yesteryear, TK. I'm sure you've heard this news. By announcing that a vote for them will mean the reintroduction of national service.
Yes, I've heard the news, although I had to look it up because it is not a part of my living memory.
Exactly. Well, I mean, for anyone else listening, it's another word for conscription, maybe military conscription. That's what people will recall anyway. That's what will come to people's minds when they would have heard that announcement coming out, right? Although
I was shocked, to be honest.
Well,
right?
yeah,
it's 2024. I was like, what? Okay, that's interesting.
Exactly. I think most people were, right? The odd thing, obviously, is when pushed or challenged by media reporters, Sunak said, well, no, it's not forced military conscription, but it's something else where, yes, we do want to heavily encourage or mandate in some way young people to go on some kind of extra voluntary work of some kind. It is not very clear what this announcement's all about, but
yeah,
the word or the phrasing of national service, I think, has got everyone's alarm bells ringing about what exactly is going on. The interesting thing when I was reading it is that his reasons for announcing it, and just to quote, he's apparently said that young people need to be, quote, kept out of trouble, as lots of parents are, quote, worried about what their children get up to on the weekend.
Lots of, his electoral base, I'm sure, is worried and is probably supporting this.
It's fascinating how a prime minister clearly feels strongly enough about young people that he has decided that he knows what's in their best interest when it comes to, national service being the answer to, I don't know, teenage delinquency or whatever it is that he's thinking about. So anyway, that was inspiration enough, I think, TK, for me to start thinking about, what's it all about when leaders, people in positions of power, feel the need to be very directive in telling people what they should be doing.
Under the punishment of law, yes.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start with that in today's episode, TK. What do you think? Where should we start this conversation? I have some thoughts, but I don't know if you wanted to.
I would say that if the topic is actually like putting this aside, that directiveness is what we're exploring here, which we are. It's like, for many people, a leader is supposed to be directive. It's synonymous, especially for the people I would say, that definitely support, because there are people that support this particular step, that are willing to, put their vote to this particular party. And they do think that that actually it will be helpful for people that are a bit rudderless to actually tell them what to do through, being directive. So I do believe that many people hold this view as, well, something that's proper fact and truth and, divine right for a leader to be directive. Because possibly, most of them haven't ever been leaders.
Fair enough. I mean, it's possibly. I can see that what you're saying, arguing, is it's a strong belief they have that this is an answer to a perceived problem. I I mean, look, as any society, there are obviously challenges when it comes. There are obviously challenges when it comes to, um, you know, young people and their role in society and how they contribute and how they give back or how they integrate into becoming fully active adults, etc. Right?
Mhm.
I mean, there's no I would say discussion point there really. I mean, that's quite a broad enough you know I think it's a broad enough thing that any society you'd find this discussion happening.
Yes, there's young people everywhere.
There's young people everywhere, exactly. The problem, I suppose, is that what's caught people by surprise is, as you kind of say, TK, is the very strong belief that this particular policy is going to fix that challenge. And I think, and then I suppose, okay, there's policy announcements that always, happen, and governments are very, that's typical pattern of government behavior, and more often not, these things also happen around election cycles as well. This is also common. What I think struck out or stood out, I think for me as well, is you're going back to a policy that was long abandoned as well. It reached a point where it was no longer seen of value. Society's attitudes and perceptions of something like national service, conscription, whatever you want to call it, had changed, and it fell out of favor. When I was doing a bit of reading, that's some of the things. I think it was the 50s, 60s, around that time. Even the military themselves decided that we don't need an army that is full of effectively young men. Troop heavy. We've got more modern equipment nowadays. We don't need this. Plus, also societal attitudes were changing. People were not that keen on being forced to, partake in military service. There's also this, I think, another angle to that was also the wealth changes and societal changes in terms of the economy. People were obviously perhaps poorer, less economically strong in less economically strong positions. So they were more willing to maybe go along with that. It gave them security, stability at a time in their life when they needed it. But as I said, when things started changing economically in the country, I think people started seeing, well, actually, I've got other options. I can go and study. I can do this. I can do that. I don't have to do. Why should I be forced to do military service? So, anyway, so a bit of that context background makes it all the more fascinating that a modern prime minister, supposedly, has decided the need to go back into the policy book of 40, 50, 60, whatever years ago and pull something out the hat there and say, here you go, we need this back again, because that's going to solve our problems.
Yeah, I myself, I'm a bit, you're skeptical that it will fix the problems, as I hear, but I don't necessarily think that, I believe that we're living in the area of populism, and he's doing it because there are people in his electoral base that actually think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
And he's appealing to them especially, obviously, right? So that's more interesting to me, rather than, what the prime minister thinks is what these people think.
Right.
About about this particular aspect. So essentially, the key point here in my mind is that people need to be forced under some authority to learn to respect it and to learn, let's call it social and productive behavior, right? The way to do it is to put them under heel. And many people believe, and this is like the classic McGregor's theory, X and Y, that, young people, of course, rebellious. There's always been young people, and there's young people everywhere, and these problems aren't new. And the area just changes, and the clothes and the music just changes. The problems stayed the same. They're just in the nature of humanity and, the rebellious nature of young people. Very classic. But the interesting thing is, this has been applied. This type of thinking has been applied for quite some time.
Yeah.
And people thought this will actually work.
Yeah.
But moreover, I think, these people of a certain age, of a certain generation, and dare I say, of other generations too, still hold this belief that for behavior of people that they don't find productive, right? If young people are rebellious, or they believe that, they're up to no good or doing nothing at all, just being lazy, if I can just use these terms as an example.
Yeah.
What they need is some directiveness. This will definitely help, right? It will stamp all these nasty behaviors out of them. That's still a pervasive style of thinking.
Well, I mean, I suppose what we're discussing is the method, right? The goal is perhaps admirable. You want to have, as I said earlier on, TK, isn't it? You want young people in society positively contributing and being positive role models, all the rest of it. That's what you want. How you get there, that's the debate. Are you going to take this directive approach where we'll tell you what to do, we'll mandate this particular thing because that's how you're going to fix you, or are there any other options on the table, right?
Or perhaps young people just need to be young people, and they need to go through this. And I hate to say the word phase, but it's only natural that they're searching for their compass. They, put their energy somewhere. Theoretically, one would say, you say military service, but obviously there's other options in terms of the community service in the national service. But still, I think the big point you're making and we're making here is the compulsive nature of it. Not encouragement, not nudging, but like you're drafted. So
let's come off that point. Sorry, let's jump off that point. Go back a bit in terms of where did this kind of directive style come from? So 1971, Administrative Science Quarterly article, and a report was written, or an article, I suppose, was written by a chap named Robert House, titled A Path Goal Theory of Leader Effectiveness. This was, where this idea of directive leadership it came from through this article that Robert wrote. He stressed in there the interdependence between, you have leaders and followers, and noting that leaders' behavior is really contingent on, how performant line reports or people who follow leaders or employees or whatever you want to call it is. So if they're satisfied, motivated, performing well, that has an impact on leadership behavior as well. But so there is some dependency. But he effectively, and he co-wrote a paper with Terence Mitchell, and they talked about 4 different leadership styles, and directive leadership was one of the styles that he talked about, and the idea came from that work of his. So that's just some context going back. Where does this directiveness come from? I mean, it is interesting when looking into that and reading into it that he didn't articulate or, suggest that is the only method of leadership that should exist. He just presented that as one of 4 options, and in his view, he thought that it would be up to leaders to decide when to draw on which style based on the organizational context they're in.
Yep. Quite similar to Situational Leadership by Ken Blanchard.
Yeah.
And, when you look at, obviously 1971, the concept itself, as in the directiveness and leadership has existed as long as humans exist, but this is just codifying it and putting these styles together. But yeah, this exists. And I think this is an interesting point, saying that, first of all, obviously there's different styles of leadership, but the point being made here, and various other methods I'm making, is that the directive style has a place.
Yeah, and have you got it? Well, so let's talk about that. The idea of it having a place. Have you got any initial thoughts on what that kind of place could look like? I mean, I can understand when things are very clear, when the challenge is quite known, perhaps, and people understand their roles quite clearly, and the tasks that need to be delivered are well defined, some directiveness may work. I suppose what will maybe be the impact of continued directiveness is going to be an impact in terms of motivation, satisfaction. I can't see that being sustained over the long term if you're constantly operating in that stance all the time.
Well, but let's maybe so first of all, there's knowledge work and not knowledge work,
Right.
and other kinds of work, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you're a fireman in the fire crew, when you're conducting a rescue operation and there's someone directing, and obviously also applies in certain military context, so that there's an interesting one too. Directiveness is helpful to remove ambiguity and make sure there's no chaos, especially in situation of clear and present danger, including the sense of urgency. So that's one thing where people surrender, possibly even their free will. In the military, obviously, you've got orders and such, where this theoretically can work. But on the other hand, if you look at these institutions, in the long term, it's not always directive, right? There's these, let's call them combat or action situations, where directiveness, for obvious reasons, might be helpful, but in the long term, for instance, there's lots of mission-based thinking. There's a lot of care in these institutions, making sure you feel really well included. So this directiveness is in moments when it's really needed, but on the outside, as you said, it wouldn't be helpful if it continued all the time. So that's a special one. Another case, I would say, is, well, if you look at situational leadership, is in situations where the person that's looking up to you for leadership looks up for clear direction, right?
Yeah.
You don't know what you're supposed to do. You feel like, oh, I don't know. How am I supposed to do that? What am I supposed to do? I'm lost. And, a leader might step in and offer direction to a varying degree. But it seems like there are situations, and we've all seen them, when the person clearly needs that. But they're asking for it, right? So is this real directiveness? Who knows?
Interesting. And interesting when you're comparing those kind of situations, TK. I take the point around the contextual bit, and you described like earlier on around the differences. Sorry, when even within a military context or a very high pressure situation where life and death is at stake, right? I think I'm just thinking, going back to what I was saying earlier around like the toll that might take long term, if that's the only mode, right? That's what I was wondering. I suppose it's the effectiveness of that over a longer period. I can see it being immediately impactful. It will maybe resolve or get to it'll be efficient in getting to the solution. What does the impact mean on the person? That's what I'm thinking about. But okay, why don't we?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I actually have a thought around that, because I think I've analyzed that, and you might remember, Arif, we had a case similar to this recently.
Right.
So a case that we had is there was a person. Let's not go into too much detail. No. And what happened there is, there was an opportunity to run a training session,
right,
on a topic that the person wasn't necessarily like fully familiar with.
Right.
Now, what happened there is possibly the person wasn't as happy to take on the risk of running a session on a topic that there might be not fully familiar in right now, and they were slightly reluctant to jump in, as it is normal. But I think the challenge there is an interesting one, is because if you are in an organization that someone else makes decisions in, you might be forced to do something that you don't feel you can deliver a great job on. You don't feel like you will be able to properly contribute, or not even feel comfortable, but be able to do it at all. Someone might order you to do it, and thus it breeds a situation where people are reluctant to contribute, to take risks, to be effective, just because it's like, okay, well, if I sit down quiet, no one will, maybe someone else will be chosen. If I say anything, this person that can give me a direct order can say, you go and do it. And that's the last thing you want, right? So you essentially will be caging this situation. Now, that's a very negative impact because you lose so much talent, you lose so much initiative and engagement just because you're directive, right?
Brilliant point. And funny you say that, because actually I was just going to bring in to the conversation. In 2014, there was a study by a chap named Clement Bell and some of his colleagues, researchers, and they basically found that both a more directive style and a more participative style, when decision making is perhaps a bit more equally shared, or other people are involved in what's happening, they were both found to have positive effects on organizational culture, but a directive style made employees less adaptable. Because as kind of what you're saying there, there's this kind of, well, I don't need to speak up, don't say anything, I don't need to ask any question. I'll just get told what to do. So it's in the kind of work we're doing right now with one particular client. I use this phrase with some of the people we're working with, which is, you're not mummy and daddy to the team. That's how I phrase it, because I think that's a very relatable analogy. So what I mean by that is, when you become mummy and daddy to the team become, I suppose, conditioned to a mummy and daddy figure, effectively telling them what to do and when they need to do something, and checking up on them why they haven't done their homework, etc., right? As a parent, I know exactly what that is, and I can see that with my own kids. So it's totally normal analogy for me, and it applies in the same context. So then there's this conditioning that happens, and so the child or the team member in this case obviously becomes like, okay, well, I'll just sit here. I'll get told when it's dinner time. I don't need to ask any questions. I don't need to rock the boat. I don't need to do anything, right? Because the parent figure will tell me what to do next.
They will. Very easy. And, you can come back to our previous episode about self-fulfilling prophecy to understand more why that happens.
Brilliant. Let's take a break, TK, and see where we go next. See you in a bit. Are you looking to expand your leadership knowledge? Well, join us for a live LinkedIn webinar on Tuesday, 18th June at 5 p.m. Together with our friends from Project 23, a leading UK DEI consultancy, we'll be hosting a panel discussion exploring how leaders must embrace their fears in order to stay relevant in today's workplace. Simply visit our website and scroll to the bottom of our homepage to register. And if you're listening to this episode after the event, you can catch all of our webinar recordings on our YouTube channel. Thank you. Welcome back. And before the break, we were discussing some of the challenges with a directive style of leadership and how it can impact team behaviors, and also what it means for employees, for example, in an organizational setting. I think let's move the conversation onwards in terms of what's next, right? How do we get out of this directiveness stance? Or maybe not so much get out of it, but perhaps consider multiple other options that need to be, part of the leadership toolbox. An equation, and make leaders, and those of you listening, perhaps think about how else or what else that needs to be thought about when working with employees. So, I mean, one of the interesting examples of all of this I was looking at was we started the episode with government policy and how in an election cycle these kind of things, policy announcements get made and all that good stuff. And there's a link to that in the sense of how government policy works. And when there are public health messages, for example, it's interesting to see how there's a lot of, I suppose, behavioral science around what type of public health messaging actually is impactful and effective and what isn't. Because essentially in public health messaging, it's about behavioral change. You're trying to tell your citizens, do this for your own good, and also because it saves us money in the long run when it comes to our health service or health system or whatever, and is better for you. Don't do this because it's not good for your health, and it's not good for the country, and it's not good for our population as a whole, right? That's what the whole point is. And you're effectively trying to shift behavior from A to B, X to Y, however you want to describe it. So I think there's some interesting lessons there in terms of how do you persuade or how do you shift from one to the other. And so does a directive style work? So if you just play a little test here, TK, you're walking down the street, wherever you are, and you've got a public health message on some, we see it, in fact, here in the UK as well, but you know, you've seen it, you've got a McDonald's being advertised, and there on the bottom of it, or on the bottom of the advert on the side of somewhere, it says junk food makes you fat, right? What do you think? I mean, would it stop you, or would it make you consider that actually I should change my behavior, I should do something different?
Well, it's interesting. I think, you know, we are all somewhat sensitive to certain messages, right? Some people like to be in great physical and body shape. Some people advocate body positivity. Some people, for instance, in many countries, cigarettes are labeled with gruesome pictures and slogans, and yet, you know, people still smoke them. It's like quite surprising. And, you know, the public health authorities are doing their best to get people away from smoking. And yet people still do, because nicotine is one of the most, you know, the substances that's very addictive, incredibly addictive.
Yeah.
But I think there is one instance, as you've mentioned, you know, a public health situation. I guess everyone might remember a certain public health situation in recent years,
right,
that has been around.
Okay.
So I remember when this public health situation was happening, April 2020.
Did it begin with a C, TK, and end in 19?
Might have. I barely remember. But I think I was, you know, people were involved in it. So I remember when this has happened, right?
Brilliant.
And various countries had different rules,
yes,
when it comes to that.
Definitely.
In the UK, I always thought that it was very positive that you could actually go out to, you know, do some running, do some exercise, very beneficial for mental health in this period of, well, I would even call it terror, right?
Okay,
People were really, April 2020, not knowing what's going to happen and so on. So this was that. I remember I bought myself a bicycle. I mean, you know, oh geez, these bicycle shops were open. And it's just like, well, we all remember these situations. But there was one thing. During April, what happened is in the UK, there's been a bank holiday. I can't remember exactly. There's been like a bank holiday thing, and it was really, the weather was beautiful. And the celebrity health secretary at the time, which, you know, I don't want to name names, but you might remember the guy if you were in the UK around these times, said the following thing. Okay, so now you can go out and do some sports activities outside for your mental health. But if people take this opportunity of this bank holiday Monday and go out into the beaches, into the park, just to, you know, sit outside, where it's obviously we shouldn't do that as much, more restrictions would need to be introduced. And I remember myself at the time really worrying about more restrictions introduced, as I was really looking forward to riding my bike as much as until my legs fell off. And I remember that particular time on this, I think Monday, when there were these drone shots of the shores and beaches in the UK, completely empty, when people heeded his warning. And that's something that I think worked.
Interesting. There is also another side to all of this is in that same period. Sorry, since you brought it up, now I've got all sorts of...
Well, you know, it's hard to forget it, I guess.
We had certain political individuals, or sorry,
Yes.
certain politicians who consistently undermined this public health messaging by, raising questions or suggesting it wasn't as important, or it's okay if you do this but not that, all of this kind of stuff, which frayed at the edges. And I think that then overall leads to a breakdown in that messaging being consistently heard.
See, and that's quite
right?
decent, right? So these political public figures that is done that's one thing. Obviously, later on, it turned out that these political people were, blatantly disregarding their own policies.
Exactly.
But
hypocrites is the word.
Yes, politicians, one word, right?
Yeah.
But going back to it, what's really interesting is some other people, like, YouTube people and so on, and some other opinion-creating people were also really undermining the policy of, you need to lock down, you need to, wash your hands, and so on and so forth, right? I remember at one point I was riding an Uber. It was like actually August 2020. So things quieted down for a moment in 2020, as some of you might remember. And I was riding this Uber. And I said, this is quite tragic. A lot of people died and so on. That's that. And I was actually riding with a lady, and she said, "Well, have you seen the bodies?" So, in fact, I would say in situations like that, when there's a public health emergency, as you say, life and death situation, directiveness maybe has a place, because, people have their own mind. And sadly, nowadays, in like 2024, people are susceptible to manipulation for all kinds of means. Well, they always were, but there's just more means now.
That is true. Yes, you're no longer consuming information from a single source, right? I mean, that's gone years ago now, and it's getting... As worse is probably the wrong word to use. It's getting more and more the case. It's the norm. That's no one consumes information from a single source. Just to move the conversation a little bit, and the reason I brought up the whole public health angle on this, because I think it's quite interesting in terms of so we've established it is effective up to a point, right? In terms of maybe challenging the consumer of the information about, are they doing the right thing, don't do that, etc. Right? And it works if there's...
So nudging them as...
So that's the point, is it nudging them into considering other options. Now, that's a different approach, because what you're saying is... Because one of the problems with the first, where we started at this kind of mini conversation is people then get worried about their sense of freedom and control being lost, because it's like, I now no longer have control over what I'm doing, because some other body, the government in this case, are telling me what I should be doing. So I'm going to immediately put my back up to that. And no, so I think that goes back to the whole national service thing as well. So you're badly behaved. We're going to tell you what you need to do. Sorry, get lost. I as a parent, for instance, know my children better. I know how to discipline, or whatever it is. I think I can handle how I would like to bring up my child, or whatever, right? That is going to be the kind of response. So instead, I think one of the other things I was looking at was this idea of pointing out a disconnect instead, in terms of their thoughts and actions, or between what they might recommend for others versus what they do themselves, right? If you're the idea being that people are always striving for internal consistency. They want their attitudes, actions to line up. So if you're highlighting that, hold on, you're not, your behavior doesn't line up, right? Then it's sugar. I need to think about that. That's not. So there's an example I was looking at. Health officials in Thailand use this approach in an anti-smoking campaign, right? Rather than telling their smokers their habit was bad, they had little kids coming up to smokers on the street and asking them for a lighter. Obviously, smokers told the kids.
I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah, no. Many even lectured the little boys and girls about the dangers of smoking. But before turning to walk away, the kids then handed the smokers a note that said, you worry about me, but why aren't you worrying about yourself? So that clearly just exposing the hypocrisy of their action and behavior there, right? So they don't want the kids to smoke, but they're happy to smoke themselves. And then there was a helpline number if they want help to get out of their smoking addiction. Apparently, they saw an increase of 60% in terms of calls to that helpline. So that is a staggering number. Fascinating. So, leadership lessons from that, as an example, I suppose, is what I suppose TK is if you're working with your employees and you want to see more different behaviors and you want to see improvements, all the rest of it. Maybe there's something there, do you think, around how we handle the conversations with employees and stuff. So we're not telling them, don't do this, do that, but actually, well, what's stopping us? And we're not doing this, yet we're also doing this, and there's a disconnect, something like that. I don't know. What do you think, TK?
First of all, I like the example you brought up with the, children coming up and asking for a light. I think this is a great nudge because it involves like basic care instincts of people, right? We care for our children. That's, it's a very instinctual, primal thing. And as such, people will really notice this problem. Although I believe that that's a great, well-constructed social campaign. But people have a great talent for being able to be incongruent internally because it feels... Yeah, well, as humans, we just have a tendency to adapt with our incongruencies, despite, for instance, many people, for instance, practicing a belief system or other great things, and yet, doing awful things that definitely aren't prescribed in these systems. That's an example, right? But nothing to do with the systems, more to do with person's nature and, being able to be incongruent there. But I think there's other approaches too that will also work. I'll mention two possibly. There's a great book, Nudge, and I can't remember the author. I read it quite some time ago, where they actually talk about the social techniques of modeling behavior through not introducing very strict rules or telling people to do things. Examples. As an example, one of the suggested things, some countries have implemented that. If you want to encourage organ donation, right, important stuff, you make it opt out and not opt in.
I've seen that. Yeah.
So that's one good nudge, I think, which is quite great. I personally support that quite a bit. And if in your belief system or however you think you don't want to, of course you can opt out. It's completely your choice. I'm taking the freedom away. No, not necessarily. You still have the freedom. It's just like if you strongly believe in it, opt out. Another thing that's, I think, in the UK. First of all, in many countries, you've got, and I think the countries I've observed, first of all, cigarettes. We've talked about cigarettes and smoking quite a bit. Very harmful, very addictive, very difficult, right? And I'm hoping that, in like 10 years, it will be like nearly diminished because there's no positive side of it at all. But many countries, first of all, hide the cigarettes. So you can't see them when you're walking around. You can't see it. You don't have the impulse to buy them.
Yeah.
Right. And it's by law, they're hidden. Yeah. And the packages are awful.
Right.
Absolutely. It's like, with all these gruesome things and slogans and so on, right? You physically have a choice. You can go in and buy a pack of smokes, but it's not that it's difficult. They do everything to, nudge you away from it as much as possible, right? And your freedom isn't impeded. You can still do it. It's just that they're trying not to get more people involved in this nasty habit. There's more examples, right? Just how to nudge people to certain behaviors without necessarily implementing it. One of the examples, and if we've talked about that. For instance, we're working with a client and we did it without necessarily thinking about it, because we are helping them by joining some meetings they have.
Right.
So we, for the sake of convenience, created an email alias so they can invite the email alias. And in fact, we've seen a bigger attendance to these meetings and more adherence to keeping a certain process, because they know they have to send it to someone else, and someone else can drop in unannounced. So that's also a bit of a nudge, isn't it?
Yeah,
like
so
these things, without necessarily implementing something that's really mandating it, can be great nudges.
Good examples, DK, and thanks for sharing. And so I hope for our listeners and our leaders out there listening can get some inspiration from these stories to think about how they can create nudges and behavioral shifts for their teams to get them to where they want to be without having to be, explicitly directive. Although that has although as we've established and we've discussed, that has its place depending on the context we're in. It's just that's not maybe a sustainable long-term strategy.
No.
That's probably the discussion, really. So great. I think I'd like to end the episode there. I don't know if you have any summary thoughts, TK, as we close today's episode.
I have a very interesting thought and a quick one.
Yeah.
Do you know what? When I was a young person, I was actually offered to go into a military service, a special new program, 2 weeks, somewhere, and I was supposed to become an NCO and so on.
Right.
And because there was also the fear of mandatory conscription at the time it was ending, when I've been young in Poland and so on, I was so afraid I didn't take it.
Oh dear.
And to be honest, I should have. I should have gone to, for this 2 weeks. And I think it would have developed me better as a leader.
Okay.
So, at the end of this episode, after all that, I would say that the fact that, there was a mandatory aspect of it and I wasn't encouraged to volunteer, maybe as a young person, stripped me of the opportunity to develop myself better as a leader. So food for thought for policymakers.
As we're closing the episode as well, I think my only other thought is I'd like to explore the more participatory angle, the opposite side of this management style. Maybe we'll do that in next episode or a future episode very soon. But that's a great way to end the show. Thank you very much, TK, for your thoughts there, and for all of you listening as always. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe to our podcast and give it a like or a comment, because all of that helps with the algorithm. So thank you very much. And until next time, we'll see you on our next episode. Thank you.
Bye-bye.